อย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทีลงไปมีความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA
Thank you for having us. It's a great opportunity, and I hope that after today, once we go through an overview of AWS security capabilities, you'll get a better understanding on how we do security in the cloud. If you look at the agenda that we just shared, we'll be starting with a very 100 level view. So essentially the first session, the 45 minutes that I will cover will be focused on understanding AWS security, the capability, the products that we offer that the customers can use. So to give you a high level of agenda, what I'll be talking about today is overview of AWS security, right? As I said, what kind of security capabilities available in the cloud. Understanding shared responsibility. This is a key concept in the cloud. So when you move your workloads into the cloud, it is really important to understand that now your security responsibility is shared. And I'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to that. We'll run through security and compliance programs. So there are numerous security certifications and programs that AWS is compliant to, and what benefit that offers to you, and how we can leverage that when you're building your environments on AWS. And so towards the end, I've got a list of all our security capability, right? So we'll briefly talk about it. It's a fairly large portfolio. It's something that we usually cover in a 2-day workshop on doing a deep dive and understanding each one of those security capabilities. So the intent today will be giving you a high-level overview of what's there, and then I have about 9 different design patterns of how you can really apply security. And one of the key things that I want to talk about when we look at those design patterns is understand when we say that security in the cloud is powerful, it's superior with regards to how you traditionally do security in a data center. Those 9 patterns will essentially give you a view of why is that the case, right? And then towards the end, happy to take any questions, and then if there are more clarity that's needed on anything, we can either do in a Q&A or happy to take it offline as well. So quick overview of those who are new to know about Amazon Web Services and what do we have. So and also laying a foundation of some of the key terms that I will be using, right? So we use the term called regions. If you see that AWS has 22 regions across the world, and what that means is a region specific to a geographic location, right? So we have 22 presence. So if you can see the list over there, right from US to Europe to Asia and Middle East, we have facilities across the world. And in each of the regions, we have what we call as an availability zone. We refer to that as an AZ for short. Every region has a minimum of 2 availability zones. And the whole idea behind that is to provide a fault-tolerant, redundant environment where you can architect your environment based on failovers and designing your applications using the 2 availability zones. There are some regions which have more than 2 availability zones, 3 and plus. It really depends on location to location how it's distributed. Besides that, we also have edge locations. These edge locations are what we call as the content delivery networks, and they are used to deliver content when you are designing your application. You want a good user experience. You may have users who are sitting outside of your region. So you may have services running out of Singapore, but you have your customers sitting in Thailand. So if you want them to have a good user experience, there will be local CDN locations which will cache the content and will provide a faster experience to your end users, right? So that's some basic terminology that I will use. I will keep using the terminology called AZs for availability zones and edge locations or CDNs. So just laying the foundation for that. So this is something that you will see from AWS. We say security is our number 1 priority, and I'll be repeating some of the things later on and giving you an understanding of that a bit more in depth, right? We say we are designed for security. Every product and service that you will use on AWS has security built into it, right? It's not an afterthought. It's not something that you bolt on top of it. It's designed with security in mind. 2 of the things that we'll also talk about is continuous monitoring and automation. Really, really key. When it comes to security, you need the visibility. And when you get the visibility, you need to be able to manage, you need to be able to react so that you can take action, right? And cloud, the way it is designed with regards to the security, has those features built into it, right? So we'll look at those a little bit more with the use cases that I have towards the end, and it'll make more sense. And as I go through some of the more slides on security capability that AWS has, you will get more understanding of what these really translate to. So this is probably one of the most important slides, which is key to understanding the concept around security responsibility. So this applies not just to security, but it also applies to compliance. So what it really means, right? So you see, there's a breakup between the customer and Amazon. So what we are saying is that if you take an example of your existing data center, right? So you build your own data center, you own your own infrastructure, you secure it, and you make it compliant as well. So the full responsibility sits with you. But when you move into the cloud, the responsibility gets split. So what that means is now everything that is the underlying infrastructure, so just give you a more clear view of that. So when we talk about underlying infrastructure, is infra that is managed by Amazon, right? Which is our physical locations, our availability zones, our content delivery network, the foundational services that we offer, the compute, the storage, the database, the network. So all of that is taken care of from a security and a compliance by Amazon. So you don't need to worry about securing that infrastructure. So anything that you put on top of AWS, on top of our environment, is where you need to start doing your security. So if you look at the blue portion of it, which essentially talks about this is what is managed by the customer, this is what is managed by you, or it could be something that's managed by your managed service providers. What AWS does in the top part of that blue section is that we provide you with the security capability, whether that is identity access management, whether it's data security, infrastructure security, logging capability, management tools. So you have that capability from AWS, and you are the ones who have to configure. You are the ones who have to actually manage and configure it, right? So that's the responsibility that sits with you. Now this applies with compliance as well. So if you need to be PCI compliant, so AWS has PCI compliance from an infra perspective. So everything in the orange, you don't need to worry about compliance. You only need to focus on the compliance of the systems that are part of the scope for PCI compliance. So if you look at it, it really takes all the cost and complexity out of your projects, right? So you now have to only focus on the delta. Now this is really key and an important concept, and it is very different to how you do security in your data center. So now you essentially have Amazon sharing your security with you. So another key concept, your data stays where you put it. So this is something we get audited for. This is something we provide evidence to our customers for. So if you select one region, so that region could be within Asia Pacific, could be Singapore, could be Tokyo, could be Sydney. If you select that region and if you decide to store your data in that region, it stays there. We do not move it, we do not copy it, we do not replicate it. You as a customer own your data, you control your own data. The only way the data can move from one region to another region is if you yourself do it, right? Now that's important because data residency is important, data security is important, and having the transparency that the provider is not moving the content is equally important. So we'll look at some of the compliance programs. So we have more than 50 plus certifications, the industry certifications, and numerous other compliance programs that we run. And so when you look at this slide, right, so we have some of the global ones, so whether these are the ISOs, the PCI, the Cloud Security Alliance. There are some which are very US specific. We also have some which are focused on Asia Pacific and Europe as well. Now when you look at it, it looks like a marketing slide, but I think this is one of the very powerful slides. And the reason for it being so powerful is when Amazon is compliant to all of these standards, what we are doing is we are implementing 1800 plus security controls in our infrastructure. So when you as a customer move on to AWS, you end up inheriting all of those security controls, right? So that really improves your security posture. So the value essentially is, how to reduce the cost, how to reduce the complexity, and how do I make my security better is by inheriting these controls, and which also makes your compliance programs much, much easier to manage as well. So we also have a service. Later in the second half, we will be doing a little bit of a hands-on exercise, and we can explore and we can show you how you can get access to all of these compliance reports. So all the compliance programs that I've talked about, they are available. You can download the reports, which has the details on how we are compliant, what's the evidence that's attached to it, and you can use these compliance reports to give it to your auditors. Right? So if your auditors are asking for reports, you can download. So this is the link, which is called the artifact. So you can essentially go on the AWS console, navigate to artifact. It will get you to sign an electronic NDA, and post that you will be able to download all of these compliance reports, and then you can provide these compliance reports to your auditors. All right, so let's start taking a look at more of the security operations. So we're going to start focusing more on above the line, right? So if you looked at the shared responsibility model, we talked about AWS responsibility. I'm now going to focus more on the capability that we provide to the customers that they can configure and they can, according to your security requirements, manage that security component. All right. Okay, so how do we? So it's when you're moving. So this is one of the really interesting things about security and compliance that I often say. You can be 100% compliant, right? But you can never be 100% secure, right? And our role is to ensure that we provide you security capability and the tools so that you can elevate your security. So how can you go from being less secure to being more secure? Essentially, that's the goal, and it's a continuous process, right? You would start from best practices, you will refine those best practices, and you will keep on adding more and more security capability. You will add more automation, and we'll show you some of the examples on how do you improve your security posture by and elevate your security when you move to the cloud. The first one I already talked about, you inherit all of these security controls. That definitely is an advantage. All of a sudden you have, 2200, 1800 security controls that improve the entire infra security. How can you scale? Now, scale is really, really important. To give you an example, right? In your data center, if you are running a web application, you install that web application, you have the infra around it, you may have your routers, switches, your firewalls, your operating system, and you harden all of that, right? And now if you want to multiply and you want to scale, you say, okay, I've got one web server, I now want to have 5 of the same. Now you have to go configure each one of them on its own. Now in cloud, it's different because everything is software driven. You can create your infrastructure as code. What that means that now you can scale and build your security once and keep repeating it, right? So you simply say, okay, I want to now simply copy the security settings that I have on my environment and keep replicating it. So you can really have that scale and the consistency that it provides you and the accuracy it provides you in implementing the security controls. So we have some of the highest data privacy and data security controls, and I'll talk about this one quite a lot. So you might find me repeating data privacy and security quite a lot because I believe it's really, really important. Not only we do have the security standards, we also have individual country level PDPAs, which are the Privacy Data Protection Acts, which usually the countries have that we are compliant to. And we provide the capability to our customers that if they need to be compliant to their privacy programs, they have the relevant tools in order to be compliant. Automation is key, right? We talk about automation quite a lot. The example that I gave you, that how you can scale. When you are scaling, you're automatically applying all the security settings, right? I don't need to recreate an environment, write my policies again. All I need to do is write it once, put it into the form of code, and keep on adding on to it. It's just like how you do your software release management. You write your code once and you keep pushing the settings after that, and it gets applied across your environments consistently. I've got a slide where I just want to give you a brief overview of the kind of partners that we work with, right? We have got a mix of global partners, technology partners. We also have local partners in countries who help our customers work with them in transitioning securely to the cloud. So as I said, I'll talk about privacy quite a lot. It's really important that we do that. So I talked about data residency with regards to, we don't move the data, you store where your data is. It's absolutely important. We also provide data security capability from encryption, so you can encrypt your data at rest, encrypt your data in motion. We have a fully managed key management service, so essentially you can do the entire life cycle of your key management. I've got a use case towards the end, which we'll walk through, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we do it. We also have a cloud-based HSM, which is a hardware security module. So if you are operating in a highly regulated environment and you have some strict security controls on the storage of your cryptographic material, so this is where we offer a FIPS 140 level 3 hardware security module, right, which is something that you can use to store your cryptographic keys. So already talked about the privacy laws and how we are compliant to the various PDPAs. And again, if you need to be compliant to anything that's in country, there is capability that's available that can make you compliant. So I'm now going to give you a walkthrough of the different security capabilities that AWS offers, right? So this is something that's available to our customers to use. So when you move onto the cloud, all of these services are available. Depending on your need and your requirements, you will be able to consume these services. The other fact that I would like to highlight is that most of our services from security that we offer are either offered at no charge, or if they are at a charge, they're really at a dollars and cents point, right? So they are easy to manage from the security overhead perspective. It's not as much as you would see if you have to move a whole new product into your data center. So identity and access management. So when you first interact with AWS, when you first create your account, identity and access management is the module that you interact with. So within IAM, we have multiple services. We have directory services, we have single sign-on, you can do federation, so you can use your Google, your Facebook, or any of your identity providers where you can do the federation with. You can even do federation with your Active Directory. So I've got a use case where I'll give you an example of how we see customers doing federation with the AWS identity and access management and their in-house Active Directory, right? We also have a service called Amazon Cognito. So Cognito offers our users to create, login, sign-up pages. If you have an application that requires an authentication service, so it's very much plug and play. You can use Amazon Cognito. It's really used for a lot of mobile application developments where you need a user sign-up and login process. It supports two-factor authentication as well. The next one is detective controls. Now, key to security is visibility. And it's very important that when you have all of these services running on the cloud, you also have the visibility. So with detective controls, we have CloudTrail. CloudTrail is our API logs. So every time you interact with AWS or any of the AWS services, you make an API call. And these API calls are logged, and they provide you a wealth of information. Who is accessing what service, when they did access, what time did they access. You have that wealth of information coming in, which can then be used either by your log management tools or can be used by third-party tools to give you the visibility so you can take action, right? Really a wealth of information from detection capability that comes from CloudTrail. Similar to CloudTrail, we also have VPC flow logs. So VPC is a virtual private cloud. So when you create your environments on AWS, you can create a virtual private cloud, which is like a virtual data center. So when you have a virtual data center, you have network interfaces and you need to monitor traffic going in and out. So VPC flow logs give you the flows which are moving in and out of your environment. Again, wealth of information with regards to network traffic moving in and out of your environments. We have Amazon Guard Duty, which is a threat detection capability that we have. It provides and uses machine learning, artificial intelligence in order to give you a view of your environment with regards to the threats. If there's a bot network operating in your environment, if there is a reconnaissance that has happened, if an attacker is trying to scan your environment for open ports, Guard Duty will be able to alert you and you can then take action. So Guard Duty has a threat intelligence coming into it, which essentially enriches the findings, right? So if you find that there is an IP address in your environment that is doing a connectivity with a bad IP, which is hosted outside, the threat intelligence will be able to provide you the evidence, the details of the IP address, whether it is hosting malware, which country it is hosted out of, and it will give you that reputation based on the intelligence that will tell you and give you the guidance on how you need to remediate that as well, right? So Guard Duty has intelligence coming from CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, and Amazon's own threat intelligence. The other one I'll talk about is AWS config. Again, I have a use case towards the end which talks about config. Config is really, really powerful when we talk about compliance and continuous audit and continuous monitoring. So what config does is it lets you create a snapshot of your entire environment. And every change that happens on your environment is then recorded. You can then go back in time and you can see who has made change to which resource on AWS and what impact that had, right? To take this a step further, we also have what we call as config rules. So you can write your own rules and you can also select the ones which are available in the library, which can be used for compliance. So let's say you have an environment where you only allow HTTPS, right? 443 port is allowed and nothing else is allowed. So you can write a config rule that will check that if anyone goes and opens up any other port besides 443, it will alert you. Not only it will alert you, you can extend the capability one step further. You can automate it and say, if anyone tries to open any other port besides 443, I want it to be removed as well. So we have automation to detect it, we also have automation to remediate as well. So extremely powerful tool. Infra security, right? So we have EC2 Systems Manager. So Systems Manager is essentially a free agent-based tool that we provide, which you can install not only in your own data center if you're operating in a hybrid environment, but runs on cloud and on-prem. So it's an endpoint management tool. We have AWS Shield. So I'll cover Shield and web application firewall together as both are related. So we provide DDoS protection, which is distributed denial of service protection, in 3 different ways. We have the Amazon's infra level protection. So even before the DDoS can hit your environment, AWS has capabilities and 24/7 operations built to detect and manage DDoS attacks. What we also do is we provide AWS Shield, which is a free service, and it helps our customers with network level DDoS attacks. So there's the service is enabled. You don't have to pay anything for it. If there is a DDoS attack which is at a network level, you will get protection. We have another flavor for AWS Shield, which is called Shield Advanced. So what we find now, most of the DDoS attacks are done at an application layer, right? For this, when you subscribe to the Shield Advanced, you get a web application firewall packaged with it. So what that means is if there is a DDoS that is happening at an application layer, the web application firewall is configured and it will be able to give you the insight on what is the kind of attack, what kind of pattern that we are observing, so you can understand the pattern and take remediation actions based on the attack type. Shield Advanced also comes with a DDoS response team. So we provide a 24/7 DDoS response team who will not only help you configure your environment, so they help you configure your web application firewall, they also help you to optimize your rules. But once you have an incident, they will be able to help you during an incident and also implement the learnings post-incident. So it's an extremely important service, as DDoS continues to be one of those attacks which can cause a lot of damage from an availability perspective to environments. So let's look at data protection, right? So I briefly talked about the key management service that we have. So when you do encryption on AWS, it is really, really simplified, right? So to give you an example, we have Amazon Simple Storage Service, as it's called, S3 for short. So if you have your data sitting in S3 and you need to encrypt it, it is as easy as checking a box. So you simply check a box and say, yes, I want to encrypt everything. So what we also do is we offer the customers the capability where they can use our key management service. So what that means is that you can create your own data keys. So you can create your own master key and your master key will create data key. And then you can use these data keys to encrypt the storage, whether it's encrypting your database, whether it's encrypting the volumes that are attached to your virtual machines, or the S3, which is our object storage. So you can then do an entire lifecycle management. So that means if you have to rotate keys at a frequency you need to rotate, you can manage the entire rotation of those keys through key management service. We also provide the ability for the customers to bring their own keys. So if you want to bring your own key, you can import the key material into the key management service and you can still use those keys, right? Cloud HSM, I talked about it earlier. So we have a FIPS compliant 140 level 3 hardware security module. It's something that you can use if you are operating in a highly regulated environment, and it provides you a higher level of assurance for storing your keys. So Macy is our machine learning based data security service. So essentially it helps you discover sensitive data sitting in your environment. So if you have sensitive data that's sitting in your storage volumes, you can use Macy to identify and discover, because it's really important when you grow larger in your environment and you move more and more data into the cloud, you need to understand and know where my data is sitting. All right, I'll talk about config rules earlier, so I'll probably skip this one and I'll talk about config rules more in the use case that I have next. So Lambda is our serverless computing. So essentially, event-driven computing, you can take your code, you can simply upload your code without having any underlying infrastructure that you need to provision, and AWS will be able to run that code for you. So we are seeing more and more use cases when it comes to automation on how Lambda is being used. We use Lambda quite a lot for incident response, and again, I think it will make much more sense when I'll show you an example on how we are seeing customers use Lambda for incident response and how it can automate your entire incident response. All right, so I'll just walk you through 9 design patterns. So these design patterns are based on the services that I've just talked about, and they will be they'll give you a second level of understanding and how do I really apply these products and services, and you may be able to relate it with your own environment on how you can essentially lift one of these use cases. So this one is perhaps one of the most common ones that we see, right? So a customer moves into the cloud and they have 100 users that they need to provision, right? So you're not going to create 100 user roles into the cloud, right? So what you will do is you can simply integrate your Active Directory, so federation as we call it. So you can federate your Active Directory. So what that does is now all your 100 users will authenticate against your Active Directory, and you can then use the AWS identity and access management to assign roles and permissions to the users that you want to give access to. Not only can you give them a fine-grained resource level breakdown of access, such as, hey, I want to give user Bob access to a virtual machine where he or she can only do a certain task, right? So you can limit their roles, you can limit their permissions, and you can also limit the time that they have access to. So I only want to give access for 3 hours, and after 3 hours the access is taken away. So that's why it's called just-in-time access rights. So really, really good use case on managing your users accessing the AWS environment. So logging is really important, right? So I talked about 2 different kind of logs, but we do have native logging capability in all the products and services that we offer. So whether they are API logs, which are CloudTrail, they are performance logs, they are network logs, the VPC logs. For load balancer, we have logs. So essentially all of these services where you're getting all the logs, you also need an ability where you can consolidate these logs, right? And we typically see the consolidation of logs or log analytics come from a compliance background as well, or even for investigations where you need to have access to the logs because you're investigating an incident, and if something goes wrong, you can essentially look at the logs, you can look at the patterns, you can go and use tools which can help you provide visibility, right? So if you've seen the amount of noise devices can create, it is really important that you have good visibility and good capability on how you can run analytics. So consolidating the logs using the services that are available on the cloud is extremely powerful, and it gives you the insight and the visibility you need to manage your environments. All right, let's talk about encryption. So we support encryption for data in rest, data in storage. We already talked about KMS. I already talked about cloud-based hardware security modules. You can apply security and encryption to the services that I've listed. This is probably a snapshot of the services that we have, but anything that is at rest, you can essentially encrypt it, and you can encrypt it, as I said, as easy as checking a box. Whether it's S3, which is our object storage, we offer Glacier, which is our archiving, which can be encrypted, data warehousing solutions, our relational databases, anything that is at rest, you can essentially encrypt it. We also provide encryption capability for data in transit, right? So if you have data that's going from point A to point B, you can encrypt the data in transit as well. So I'll give you a use case of how we see encryption and definitely the key management, right? So whenever we talk about encryption, it's less about security, it's more about control. Because at the end, whoever has the access to the keys is essentially the one who can access the data as well. So this is where we offer multiple options. So either you can simply check a box and let Amazon manage in the background transparently the entire key management and the lifecycle, which is the easiest option. The second option is where you can use the key management, which is a managed key. Again, Amazon has the key and they're managing the key on your behalf. I find a lot of government customers says, no, I don't want to give my key to Amazon. I want to manage it myself. Well, that's fine. You can import your own key in that case. Bring your own key and you can still use the KMS and bring in your own key. Well, if that doesn't work for you, you can deploy your own key management infrastructure as well. Right? Or you can use Cloud HSM as well, which is dedicated to you. So you're more in control. So whenever it comes to control, we have multiple options on how you can do your key management, because that's an important design decision that you need to make. It could be a compliance decision as well that you need to make with regards to data security. All right, so a little bit of a background before I talk about this use case. So we have a service called autoscaling, right? So what autoscaling does in very basic and simple form. So if you have a virtual machine, or let's say a fleet of virtual machines, 5 or 10, right? You can monitor these machines for performance. So you can say, all right, I've got 5 machines and I'm expecting more load to come and hit these machines. It could be any of the events which is triggering that. And you can configure a policy, and that policy would say, if my virtual machine hit a utilization which is over 50%, go add another machine, or add 2 other machines, or 5 other machines. And what autoscaling will do, the moment it hits the policy, it will automatically add that many machines, right? So how do we apply that for security, right? So think about this. Now you have a scenario where you have a fleet of 5 virtual machines, and you need to upgrade the underlying operating system. You need to do a patch. So you can simply update the machine image at the back end and apply the patch. And what it will do, you can simply use auto scaling to roll that patches out. So what that will do for you is not only you will have the patches rolled out and the new machine spinning up, but you will have 0 downtime, right? So that's one of the ways that we usually see how customers effectively can roll patches to their environment and use auto scaling in order to achieve that. So hybrid clouds is, hybrid environments is a very common case, especially within public sector. We see a lot of governments who have their existing data centers, and they want to connect to AWS. So we offer multiple options on how you can connect. So you can simply have a service that we call direct connect. So a lease line coming from your data center and terminating right into AWS. You can use a hardware-based VPN, you can use a software-based VPN, or you can simply IPsec into the environment, right? So there are multiple scenarios which essentially gives you a secure access connecting the 2 environments together, right? So another very common use case that we see. So this is for network resiliency, right? DDoS. I talked about DDoS. I talked about the service that we have. But what I like to give you a quick rundown on how we provide best practices in building, what we call as a defense in depth model for DDoS. So here, each of the layers will offer a different level of resiliency and protection with regards to DDoS. So starting from the DNS, so we have a service called Route 53, which essentially is a managed DNS service. So if you're using Route 53, you can simply manage your traffic. You can say, okay, I want to do a weighted based traffic management. I want to send 50% to availability zone A, and I want to send another 50% to availability zone B. Or you can do a 70-30 split. You can also let Route 53 make a decision based on which is the fastest path, and I'll take the fastest path, right? So the entire traffic management can be done at a Route 53 level. So that's the first level of protection. The second level is through our CDN. So we have a service called CloudFront. So what we typically see when a DDoS attack happens, it's happening from a certain country. So you can apply geolocation rules at the CDN. So you can say, all right, I'm seeing traffic and DDoS originating from country XYZ, and I'm going to block them. So you can block them. It's a tactical thing, not a long-term thing, unless you know definitely that you are not expecting any users from a particular country. But that's another level of protection that you have. So the next one is web application firewall. So most of the DDoS attacks that happen at the application layer, WAF comes into action, which essentially will be able to give you insight on how the application vulnerability is being exploited in order to launch DDoS. So you can look at the logs, you can go through the access logs that are captured in the WAF, you can understand the pattern, and then you can write your own custom rule. So we have a hands-on lab in the second half, which essentially is using the web application firewall. So you will be able to write a rule yourself and see how WAF can stop those attacks, right? So we've got a interesting lab for you to test that out as well. So the next step is auto-scaling. So when a DDoS happens, the example that I was giving you earlier for auto-scaling, your utilization of your virtual machines will go high. So if you have configured auto-scaling policy, what that will do, it will keep on adding more and more virtual machines. So the entire idea behind having that is to ensure that the availability of your environment is there, and your customers and genuine customers who are trying to access the services are not denied of their services. If you have firewalls, virtual firewalls, third-party firewalls that you are using, they can auto-scale as well. The only catch is you just need to make sure that the licensing agreement lets you scale the licenses as well. So this architecture is what we call as a defense in depth on how you can implement DDoS protection in your environment. And one of the things that I like to highlight when I was talking about the Shield Advanced that AWS offers, we also offer cost protection, right? So when you are under attack, your environment is getting multiplied. So I have customers, their environment get multiplied to the point that they may have more than 100 plus virtual machines running, right? So we provide cost protection. So for the time that you were under attack, AWS will not charge the customers for the time they were under attack and the time that the environment multiplied in order to support. So, all right, so this is a great example of how we see that you can, so remember my second use case where I was talking about consolidated logging. So you have consolidated logging. From your logging, you can have triggers. And then you can use these triggers by using Lambda, which is the event, which is a serverless event-driven computing, and you can say, I have detected an event, and I want you to take an automated action, right? So the good example of that is of how you can automate incident response. Let's say you have a malware in your environment, right? You can get the logs from your endpoint, which is could be your antivirus, it could be your host-based intrusion prevention. It will give you the trigger. The trigger would be saying, hey, malware found. And once the malware is found, it will then take a series of actions. It will try to isolate that instance that has been impacted. It will try to contain it. It will try to take a snapshot of that virtual machine so that the forensic investigations can happen. So you can use this Lambda and serverless event-driven architecture to automate a lot of your incident response use cases. So when I started off, I was talking about scale, right? And we have this terminology which we call infrastructure as code. So you can create your entire infrastructure on AWS as code, right? And so you could have 10 different machines, virtual private cloud, IP addressing, security groups. You can select the machine images that you want to use. So you can have all of that hardening and security built into your environment, and you can write that as code. And when you write it as code, what you do is that you can now consistently deploy your environment in test and dev environments, right? So you can say, all right, here is my code and I'm going to run this. So we have a service called CloudFormation. So you can run CloudFormation, you can deploy the code, and it will consistently deploy the same environment in test, the same in dev, And every time you make a change in your test or a dev environment, you can simply push it to your production as well, right? So again, from a security standpoint, it makes things so much easier because now you have consistent security controls that can be applied across. So I was giving the example of config. So this is essentially where we talk about continuous monitoring, continuous compliance. I don't want to wait 3 months when an auditor will come and audit my environment and say, all right, I'm not compliant to 5 different things. So with config, you can essentially take all of your security policies, you can convert them into rules, and you can apply that into your environment. Whether it is as simple as checking for open ports, or it could be as complex as checking for keys that have not been used for a certain time. We create identity access management roles and policies for our users. We also give access to access keys and secret keys to them. But we often find that these keys are not being used by anyone. So you can create a policy and saying, hey, if I find a user who has not used an access key from last 60 days, disable the key. So the whole idea is that how do I reduce my threat landscape, right? And how do I reduce that attack surface? And this is essentially one of the tools that can help you be continuously compliant and continuously monitor your environment as well. So with this, I'll just do a quick wrap up of things especially with regards to security, or key takeaways as you can call them. So as I said, security is the highest priority at AWS. We always give the number one priority to security, and whether there is essentially no compromises ever when it comes to security. Integration of security and compliance, right? So the example that I was giving you earlier, how can you integrate security and compliance? How can you use tools like config to give you continuous compliance and continuous monitoring? Economies of scale, right? So I was mentioned that most of our services are available at no charge or at dollars and cents, right? And when we see that there is a new security service that a customer is looking for, we make that available to all of our customers so they can leverage the same capability across. And we have numerous examples of how we have done that for different customers of services that you guys will end up using when you move to the cloud. So again, how do you focus? Again, coming back to shared responsibility, you now focus on your systems, you now focus on your applications, you don't focus on infrastructure. You don't have to worry about the security and compliance of your underlying infrastructure. All you need to do is focusing more on your applications and your systems. Visibility, extremely important, right? If you don't have visibility, whether you're on-prem, whether you're on cloud, there's nothing much you can do, right? And that's essentially really important. Using cloud platforms as containers, right? So you can create these pods, whether it's a dev pod, a production pod, or a test pod, and then apply the security into these containers and keep replicating them as well. So this is something very interesting, right? How do you use cloud to secure the cloud? So we have cloud-based security services which are now being used to secure the cloud as well, right? So that's the services that I listed. I know there's fair amount of services that we have to probably digest in a 45-minute session, but all of them hosted through the cloud and securing the cloud, right? Which is fantastic. So we often talk about our speed of innovation, right? And this is something AWS does quite a lot, and we continuously take feedback from our customers. We are always adding more features and capabilities to essentially help our customers being more secure, as I said, right? So security is really a journey. You all start at a level and then really go through the different steps and the different maturity journey in order to get more and more secure. So I also have some resources that are available. The slides will be available to you guys. There's some of them which I recommend as good reading. It will give you a better understanding of how AWS does the security. DDoS that I was talking about, we have a great white paper that talks about network resiliency and DDoS best practices, and several documents on overall security best practices, identity access management, network architecture and design. Really helpful and good starting documents to get a better understanding of AWS security. So with that, thank you very much. Hope that was useful, and we'll see more of you towards the second half when we do the hands-on exercise. Thank you.
right, let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to say it's a real privilege to be here representing the AWS Security Organization. It's one of my favorite things to get out and be able to talk to customers and others about not just how we can raise the bar on the quality of security on AWS and implementation, but overall how we can sort of raise the quality of security across the industry. It's true from, as you heard Ankush mentioning earlier, like security is our number one priority. And as part of the security organization, my only priority is to help protect customer information. And one of the ways that we really are striving to do that, and what we see across industry, is really starting to push the concept of DevSecOps. If you notice, Ankush mentioned infrastructure as code, and as we move to a place where everything is code, you can really start to drive capabilities of security much earlier into the life cycle. So we're going to cover a little bit of that today on this presentation. So what I like to do when I focus on talking about this, instead of an agenda, so to speak, I want to look at outcomes. I want to look at what should we take away, and this is sort of how you want to look at both things when we talk about cybersecurity frameworks, when we talk about the way to deliver security into functional elements, is really looking at outcomes. And for this, really, I want to take away basically a bit of a blueprint on how to do and implement DevSecOps practices in your organization. It doesn't matter whether you're commercial, whether you're public sector. I've talked to many on both sides that have successfully been able to implement elements of this. And then a bit on creating a cloud center of excellence as your DevSecOps foundational team. And if folks are unfamiliar with that term, we use it a lot when we talk about folks first moving into the cloud, how they set up their sort of initial cloud team, how to set that up, which we usually call it a cloud center of excellence. It's part of our cloud adoption framework, and really how to now pivot using that into a sort of DevSecOps model. It's one of the few times you'll get a chance when you're doing some type of infrastructure modernization or other element, is when you sort of shift into the cloud to have sort of a new lease on being able to create new practices and development. And then how to do continuous integration and continuous development, those technical mechanisms, how they can underpin DevSecOps. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times the two are conflated, meaning a lot of people talk about DevSecOps and then they'll show you a CI/CD pipeline. All the technical elements involved in DevSecOps are just to underpin increased quality, increased pace on security. They are not a means to an end. They just help amplify the positive aspects of the practices. So let's first talk about culture. And culture is defined many ways. In this sort of arena here, what we're going to really focus on is that it's just sort of a shared notion and beliefs that govern how people are organized, how they work in an organization. And I talk about culture because it's vital to understand how to first recognize what your culture is and then change it, because that's going to be the biggest stumbling block, and we'll get into that a bit. In one of the most common sort of traditional culture areas I've seen, and this, from years of working with public sector and running programs on site at public sector agencies, this is sort of a very traditional element. You see business up there, you could replace that with mission. They're synonymous in this case. But what you see a lot of times are friction between development teams whose sole purpose is really to innovate, to provide new support, new capabilities. They want to be able to run faster. And then you see that slightly opposed by operations whose sole job is to keep things stable. They don't want to have numerous changes in And security is now trying to decide on how to limit insecurities being introduced into the environment by the development team, or the responsiveness by the ops team producing insecure states. And yet they all fall under the mission or the business. So it's really now trying to understand, how do we change the cultural elements so they're all trying to drive the business forward in a sort of risk managed way. And as we see sort of these different operating models come to pass, there's quite a few challenges we see. One of the initial elements of where you saw agile development come onto the stage, and then followed by sort of agile Scrum and now DevOps and then DevSecOps, is that you wanted to have a faster way to release capabilities into the systems, whether it was for servicing a mission downstream, or actually having a new innovative product to sell in the marketplace. And what we ended up seeing, and this is inclusive of our experience from our professional services organization, as well as what we hear from partners, and honestly what I've seen firsthand, is the vast majority of the challenges aren't technical. It's trying to mitigate issues with cultural and leadership paradigms where you have particular ways of operating that have served well in the past, but now there's a chance to actually change things up to actually improve security, because regardless of whether the operational environment of the organization is changing, the exterior landscape of security is changing. So you always have to be cognizant of that. So if we look at a lot of organizations, and many that I've worked for sort of follow these sort of current state of affairs that you would see, is business agility. And this can, like I said, you can substitute mission for this, because it has the same effect, and seen the same effect myself, is that you're getting outpaced. You have innovative capabilities you want, but from inception, or what we would call ideation, to actual release into production takes too long, costs too much, even though you may have locked funding for some of these elements. It generally has many cost overruns. There's a reason estimations are generally wrong by development teams, and a lot of it don't actually always have to do with what it takes to do the development work. It's what it takes to do remediation cycles in that software development life cycle, as well as remediating risk that security identifies. So what I always advocate for is you have to build a business case for DevSecOps. If you want to actually have a good cultural transformation in an organization, you have to gain a key coalition with leadership. They have to know what it means to impact the business and to change it in order to really break down those silos and actually reassign, realign development output. So as a basis of DevSecOps, just what is it? And so I have two definitions up there, and both are right. There's a lot of definitions we see. How many are familiar with the term DevSecOps? Do we have quite a few there? So it's been a changing paradigm there, and like I said, many people get the definition conflated with technical capabilities, when first and foremost you need to look at it as a cultural element on your business. So tenets are valuable. There's something in Amazon that every team that's constructive has a core tenets that we set, and DevSecOps is similar in that construct. There's quite a few different tenets we see. These are ones that have worked for us in particular. And the first one, is test security as early as possible. And we'll talk about that. We'll see an example of how that looks like in an actual workflow. But it's vital to, in any agile environment, to have feedback as continuous and early as possible. Anytime it's later in the cycle, for example, if you look at a traditional release management process, a lot of times security is the last gate to production. And the time you get your security testing, your vulnerability analysis, a variety of things is extremely late in the process. And if they identify things, it usually has to go all the way back to the beginning. And what that's going to cost, and now to the beginning where the developers have already moved on, have worked on other elements, other feature sets, other capabilities. Now work has to be reprioritized, other projects slip, costs are incurred in that process. And then back and forth, back through the pipeline all the way down to security again once those issues are remediated, and lo and behold, they find new ones. So right back to the beginning again. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how to improve that. But really key on item 4 there is automation. Automation is vital, especially in the security arena, because I can tell you, you will never be able to hire enough security engineers. It's just not going to happen. Automation is going to bridge that gap between available skill sets and rapid capabilities. So a lot of things on the benefits. Some of you probably have heard some of these when it comes to DevSecOps. One of the biggest ones is less waste. And by waste, we mean reducing resource cost. By doing things and catching them early in a development cycle, let's say if I can catch something in a static code analysis versus way later on into what is a full stack scanning of an environment, it'll cost less because the feedback is in a shorter cycle. It's a more manageable chunk of work that gets brought back to the developer, and you can remediate it quicker. So, and if we look at it in the traditional breakout of what we'd see at many organizations, you have the challenges across the way they're siloed. You know, traditionally I would have the storage team, which manages all of the storage attached network capabilities. We'd have the infrastructure team, the networking team. We'd have the virtualization team. All of them that have different elements that they're interacting with, building, and the development team, which somehow has to wade their way through all of these, while also managing asks from the organization on how to innovate for the business. A lot of them times not communicating well with each other. So as we move to a full stack engineering sort of paradigm, which we'll talk about it a little bit more as a DevSecOps team, but now what we're looking at are full stack engineers, which basically means people that have the skill set to not only build from the initial state of infrastructure capabilities, they know how to build networking components, but they also know how to have the software skills to actually build the business application. We'll talk about how that scales in a bit because there is some nuance to that scaling, but as a core capability element, as we get to everything as code, that's why the full stack engineering sort of paradigm and the skill set is so important. And what's interesting is originally, way back when we first started this whole idea of on-premise data centers, infrastructure build, before virtualization became a heavy topic, the whole thought of actually cost optimization through breaking things out into chunks and resource pools was thought of as it would be a great way to reduce costs and barriers. You know, you have the infrastructure team owning their budget, you have the networking team owning their budget, you have funds going directly to the developers for the business service applications. But especially as technology evolved, it became actually an increasing cost on doing business. Because now, from the minute you create an idea to getting through each component of the team, there are wait cycles. And those wait cycles, as environments have grown bigger and more complicated, with visibility being lost, with shifting priorities, have really had a pervasive hindrance on being able to build rapidly as the needs of the business. And both on the commercial side and as we've seen on mission service side and public sector, the ability now to quickly pivot to meet citizen AS and well as AS in defense and other arenas is vital. And so now having to deconstruct these legacy processes is key, because as we found, overall there's defects that can be found in each area along the way, not just security, but you may have performance defects. Or now because your population base is large and the system is going to has to scale the use, now there's scaling issues that are being found. All of these things end up coming back to the closer states way previous in the cycles. So, and obviously that reduces your time to value. So now we want to shift and look at, okay, we understand the problem. Probably many of us have experienced it. I know I have. So how do we influence cultural change onto that? So one of the first aspects that is really important is actually understanding what your culture is. A lot of organizations, even for public sector agencies at different places around the world that I've been to, they may have their mission statements and other things written down, but they were written down 20 years ago, not really aligned to the way things work out now, or they're not continuously pushed and integrated into what people are actually working on. So first is really identifying the cultures and the values that you want for your organization. And in the case of DevSecOps, that is really understanding what elements do you want to signify as you release services and products. And then next is you have to come away and construct means to communicate these elements. It's one thing to write them down or have something, let's say an internal website that has, this is our mission, this is exactly how we want to do business, but it's never communicated, there's no training, you're not hiring in that manner. It becomes lost to just some static page and content. And the other element is the award system. So, for example, for Amazon, we base a lot of our hiring, we pretty much align how we do business with our leadership principles. And there's 14 principles, and we do everything from internal awards to employees to hiring, all based on that rubric of those leadership principles. And that's a way to enforce how we want to view our cultural context in the way we do business. So it's important to have not only training and continuous training, but actually award systems. And whether it's explicit awards like customer obsession is one of our top leadership principles. And we have awards for people who sort of signify customer obsession. But there's also implicit rewards where you're doing things that sort of align, let's say, to customer obsession, and you're rewarded for that instead of being purely explicit. And then finally, hiring. Hiring is vital to any organization. And when you're hiring, it's very important that you look at, does this hire meet these cultural values that we want to instill in the organization, and sort of aligning with that? Or how do we perform onboarding so new hires can sort of be absorbed into the cultural needs of the system? So pitfalls as you go about this process. There's a reason why I said build the business case for DevSecOps, because it's extremely vital that you have leadership's endorsement on how to do this. Because traditionally, as you have elements that are siloed, that means you have leaderships and lines of business that are broken apart representing those silos. And as you bring things together, you're going to need teams from other organizational units. So it's key to have leadership not only aware, but backing these initiatives. Again, communications. I cannot harp on enough sort of the importance of communications when it comes to these elements, the feedback loops, the cycles, understanding how a rigor in a system, for example, ticketing and triage, and how you pass off information is vital. Resource allocation. So you have to be given what I'd refer to as the runway to perform your project. If you're given insufficient resources at first, there's a high chance of failure, and then that just compounds and gives an effect respect to the initiative you're on. So before you get started, it's making sure, and this actually ties back to number one, is having executive buy-in also constitutes having resource allocation, which is key. And then reporting. It's huge to actually, as you go through this process, to be able to report out success all along the way. It's vital, because in order to build sort of a positive outcome, especially if you have other folks in the organization that were leery of this type of practice or are hesitant of the move, actually showing success and continuously showing success, having running views of key performance indicators, dashboards, reports, really goes a long ways for enticing other parts of the business into this model. And timing. Timing is extremely important because it has to go with when we talk about estimating effort. Timing, if you are not timing things correctly, then you'll actually really skew what you report on success. If things were initially done for a 3-month time frame, but you can really see business value to extending something to 6 months, either way, you want to be reporting in much shorter increments and actually articulating why there is a move. And ideally, up front, as soon as you see this adjustment, is changing that timing from what the actual goal window is. Because, again, when you're doing sort of elements that talk about really shifting sort of cultural and operational dynamics of an organization, showing success early is really key. So taking careful planning on the initial first steps is huge. So the cloud adoption framework, and I recommend anybody, when you have a chance to read it, it's available on our website for free. And there's the security perspective that deep dives into the security elements of doing cloud adoption. But one of the key components of successful cloud adoption is forming a cloud center of excellence or something akin to that. And really what this is when we say a 2-pizza team, this is sort of Amazon lingo. We're saying a small team that is constructed to actually be able to pivot and produce results in a rapid fashion. And a cloud center of excellence has ownership end-to-end of what the particular element or service they're doing to move the migration onto the cloud. Now, I'm bringing this into the DevSecOps context because they're actually, as you move or migrate into the cloud, is your really vital time where you can come in and now change for everyone who moves to operations on the cloud to now operate in a DevSecOps model. And because you're already changing and moving things and you have teams and practices set up, you have APIs and visibility you didn't have before, it's a unique opportunity that should be taken advantage of, and that allows you to raise the security bar. So there's quite a few things a DevSecOps team and a CCOE are responsible for. The CCOE in general are one of their main elements is building sort of the reusable patterns. And by reusable patterns, we mean things like your machine image pipeline, your sort of level of reporting that will be needed for teams moving onto the cloud, simplification of processes, new build processes, new release management, all these sort of underpinnings and initial foundational builds that have to take place when you move to the cloud. And because of the nature of the work, it lends itself very well to actually becoming a DevSecOps team, because the CCOE will become a infrastructure as code team. They will be the initial element that builds out your, if it's AWS or CloudFormation templates and your things that actually do provisioning and automation. And getting that construct as a DevSecOps, making sure only high security quality is released into the cloud as pools of resources is vital, especially as you want to move your initial critical systems and have the proper guardrails in place. So when we talk about a CCOE, we're talking about it as a product team. And when we say product, we could say product or service, but a product team means it ends that product or owns that product end to end. That is from the original, the construct of it being released into production, operating, the maintenance of that product, the support calls, and I'll say it's if you want to talk about cultural change, that's a big one. Knowing that the team that's building the product is actually also the one that has to take the support calls on the product, does have a corresponding effect to the quality of the product. You'll notice it go up quite a bit when they start getting a lot of pages in the middle of the night, and those pages, whether it's operational bug defects or it's actually a security weakness. So at Amazon, this is sort of how we view and construct our services and teams. Whether you hear it earlier, Ankush talk about guard duty or config, like all of those things are products. Those teams own that end to end. They own security of that. They have security engineering baked into the processes. That doesn't mean we have a security org. We don't have one, like we do. So org I'm in. But what we start looking at is now the larger estate. Items across the pipelines, right? These product teams are security within their pipeline and their product and service. And then the larger security organization can be freed up to focus on what we term high judgment items, whether it's from threat intelligence or it is looking at a proper way that everyone needs to have security thresholds and what the minimum bar for security for the organization is. And there's a variety of roles depending on the organization and depending on the type of product or service you're building. These are just sort of examples a bit on some of the roles. For a CCOE, you'll likely see initially these types of roles in place because you'll be treating that, let's say, for the sake of argument, say a infrastructure as code, those initial templates built out. So Ankush mentioned virtual private cloud earlier. So that infrastructure can be fully coded and be released and provisioned automatically. So you could see that as a product they would own end to end, and meaning the construct of that, the coding, the management, and the release to the pool for other teams to use. But as time goes on, the CCOE will have to scale, right? Because you cannot have a team own so many chunks. So as you actually scale, things do get broken down into what's akin to a shared service aspect. For example, you would now have a team assigned to say, I'm going to own all the logging and monitoring functions that have to be built. We'll build those as a service, right? You can think of many of your teams as you scale up as a service teams. Your machine images, if you want to build immutable infrastructure, meaning you don't patch production, what you do is patch the machine image, or you update the source code, and that is what gets released as you terminate the production instance. And that requires usually, from a best practice standpoint, a team that owns that pipeline, or a team that owns actually building out metrics interfaces, right? If you want to be able to interface and present, and so let's say have all of your product teams present in a unified dashboard, you could have a team actually control the build out of the end of that dashboard as a service that a product team can interface with. So what you end up seeing is these elements get more granularly broken down. And for an example, if we look at our sort of older version of our web page and how sort of we evolved Amazon into this, initially this could be one team. This is managing end to end on this, but over time, things had to adapt, and elements and surface areas had to be constrained. The problem with having so many different components owned by one team is actually your risk can increase as well, because there are now a lot of voices at play, a lot of priority shifting, and there's a lot of interconnectedness in, let's say, this single page. Well, now as we break it apart, we could have individual components, or say microservices, being built out. And now things become their own product teams. For example, the search function is its own team. If something happens and there's a bad day with search, it's not affecting the rest of the site in that regard, right? These are compartmentalized. By splitting down to discrete teams, you actually have reduced your blast radius from a security perspective. And you can have more manageable releases at a faster pace because you have smaller teams involved. And you see the examples sort of how we ended up starting to break out into different microservice components, which then in turn was owned by different teams that now had the end-to-end. And then a larger, let's say, information security team that owned the view across all of those teams. So to get to the heart of the talk from my perspective, which is really having the effect of security into this team, into this pipeline, and really being able to drive business and mission value with security. So let's first talk about blind spots, because I think it's really important for folks, because I know security is a lot of times termed the no team, and rightly so. In a lot of cases, there's a huge improvement that needs to be done in many organizations and our own evolution as well on making sure we look at customers, internal customers, as far as saying no and yes to different security elements the right way. But having empathy on both sides is vital. To understand the day-to-day view of a security practitioner, as well as the day-to-day view of someone building something for the business, is key, because that'll actually end up driving, even to a technical level of use cases of how do we test things so we can reduce the burden off of our staff. And that gets back to automation, which is vital for all of this. So the first sort of blind spot that we see, these sharp edges that you have to be mindful for, one is disparate sources. And this means many things coming from many different areas. You have, for example, an organization can use open source code that they're pulling libraries from, as well as third-party commercial code that they're licensed, as well as a suite of APIs that they're building to, as well as machine images and other things, new business requirements that are being drilled down to have to be mapped corresponding, compliance programs. So all of these different things that have to be combined and managed in some type of holistic way. One of the biggest examples that we sort of see on these disparate sources is when you mention the open source example, there's a lot of elements around pulling libraries and pulling things from code down to code, and how you sort of deal with that. Many organizations pull compiled binaries into the system and actually go through and release those into production. What's really key and a better practice is uncompiled code, pulling those down, having it go through the same process and pipeline as the rest of the code you build, which means you catch things earlier from a sort of a static analysis aspect. And then another item is lack of rigor. It's really important to have automation to reduce sort of repetitive practices by humans. For example, on Amazon RDS, our relational database service that we manage for customers, we manage hundreds of thousands of those instances. If a single person had to go, let's say, patch those, it would be impossible. And even if they started, there'd probably be a bad day, because having that type of repetitive action, something will go wrong. So you want to look at points of automation to raise the bar on the level of rigor in an organization. And then scaling. And this just doesn't mean scaling up and out to deal with something like distributed denial of service. This is actually scaling down too. In the cloud, which is a huge benefit, is you can turn off resources you aren't using. So if you scaled up and then you scaled back down, you just automatically reduce your surface area. That also means, I want to highlight this point particularly, is making sure your security mechanisms can scale with the business. The one thing you don't want to be in is, as you have something that's vital for the mission, or you have something that is a highly successful product, is that security features, the monitoring, the elements involved with making sure your portfolio is secure can't scale. So it's now a limiting factor on the service scaling. You want it to be designed to actually scale up with your other mechanisms. And that sort of all comes away to, and this is where we're going to talk about CI/CD pipelines, is keeping humans away from the data. It's vital because when you have a bad day, it generally can be traced down to some process that allowed human access. So not only away from your data, but also your systems that manage the data. There's no reason in particular, outside of legacy reasons, why anyone, for example, should be able to remote into a production host system. And then if they do, there's no reason why every single keystroke shouldn't be monitored and instantly be able to be alerted on, right? Like there are always mitigations and outside cases, and you want to build the telemetry to account for those with the constant effort of driving down those cases. For example, at Amazon, so one of our security expectations is year over year implementing 80% reduction in human access. Now, that's an extremely high number. It's not right for every organization, but it's a driver for us that even if we don't always meet that year over year, it vastly reduced the amount of possibility of any human getting any visibility into any data system. So how can we change security from no? For AWS, in particular for my organization, if we say no to an internal stakeholder that comes with an idea, we did a bad job. Plain and simple, we were wrong. What we should always say is, if we can't do it that way, what's the way to get you to your goal? And we have to look at being able to craft policy and be builders, security builders, in order to help stakeholders and internal customers do that. So it's all, because honestly, if you want to be innovative in security, raise the bar with security, you have to be able to come up with new ways, new thought processes. And by not saying no, by saying, okay, how can we do it? You're starting on that path. And part of that path early on for DevSecOps is I need to prove to security to let me run in DevSecOps mode, right? If you want them to have trust in the way you're building things, there's certain aspects that you can go along to build that trust. Threat modeling is a huge one. Every single feature that we release goes through threat modeling as the very initial step. That one requires a little bit more high judgment and less automation involved, but it also knocks down a lot of the heavy burden later on when it comes to creating tests to actually evaluate security mechanisms. Separation of duties concerns is big. That's why, for example, using a CI/CD pipeline is a great way to get people away from production systems, in the sense that there's nothing, for example, for Amazon, there's nothing that can be released into production that doesn't go through a pipeline. There's no out-of-band element to do it. And there's no way for a human to circumvent the pipeline. Once you say commit your code and the sequence of testing and other things happens, there's no human that does the release. It's always the system. And that way we've created a separation of duties gap between the people building and being able to manage their systems without having to touch production. And when we sort of see an approximation of a pipeline, very, very simplified, it starts with very good control from a security perspective. Early on, source control. You want telemetry off of source control as well. For example, if you want to understand an insider threat, you want to look at what kind of code are they committing? What kind of code are they checking out? Is it related to their function? How is it in relation to the peers in their organization? Like all these sort of metrics you have built in to sort of help look across behavior and what's appropriate and what maybe not appropriate. And it's not just from an insider threat perspective. It also can just be being able to quickly find, let's say, a security invariant that got introduced into the system, is having that telemetry early on about knowing who is dealing with versioning control and how. And then the code review elements early on, for organizations that have the capabilities on modifying their own custom linters, which could actually check static code, to actually enforce proper behavior for developers, right? Like, let's not hard code credentials into our system. And if we have a linter that as I try to implement that, it automatically flags it and says, this is, you won't be able to commit code like this. That's something that's a feedback, that's early on feedback that's caught there. Imagine if it went all the way down to the end right before production release and got flagged there. All the resources consumed up to that point where it could have just been simply dealt with immediately as somebody's typing into their coding program. And then moving on down the line to static analysis and how you do packaging and other elements. So if we look at it from a workflow perspective, we see that we'll take sort of the two examples of in the orange there is someone developing their infrastructure as code, let's say an Amazon machine image, that'll go into a shared repository for other product owners to use and as they build a service, which is in blue. As it goes through that life cycle, it's important that early on threat modeling is done. As we said, we're treating everything as code. So building those machine images or building those virtual networks, CloudFormation templates is code, and threat modeling is done on the services and the code you build. And then as it goes through the cycle and the orange team has put that back into the shared services repository or service catalog, they're only allowing hardened, tested elements into that. And by having guardrails where that blue product team can only pull from that service catalog, has now instituted a great guardrails mechanism where they can only use the most up-to-date secure information. And then they pull those images and use those as they build their infrastructure and get it released to production. All along the ways, they're doing their own code review and their automated testing and smoke testing near the end of completion, which is that full stack test. And from the cloud aspect, especially with AWS, as you can start taking telemetry along every element of the pipeline and reporting on it. So that's why having things using early on telemetry and code commit all the way down to code build and coming down to the release management is vital in order to have real-time feedback. So one of the early things on as a Cloud Center of Excellence would do is look at what are the key elements that you want reportable in each of those sort of phases of development as automation pushes something through the pipeline. Because you want to break a build when it doesn't meet that security bar and bring it back to the developers in allowing you to cut a ticket. And I'll just mention real quick on the importance of ticketing when it comes to rigor on this. Every security issue should also be treated like you would any bug defect. Automatically ticketed, right back to the developer's queue with the appropriate other folks notified and escalated. And the benefit of having all of this available via API is that you can automate all of it. You can trigger something, it can ticket something, it can add it to the queue, it can escalate, have automated pager activation. All these things that would have used to require someone to triage this manually can now be completely automated. And it gets you to sort of root cause faster. So for best practices that we have used and many of our customers who sort of exemplify DevSecOps, you'll see aspects like a clean room. That is the elements of in the pipeline where you actually have nobody who can touch into that. They can commit their code, but then it's the pipeline is committed as a clean room that does not introduce any sort of security invariance in the process. CI/CD as a technical mechanism to underpin DevSecOps is now a must. Because like I said before, you're never going to be able to hire enough security engineers, enough security expertise. So now by producing a CI/CD pipeline as a mechanism to sort of elevate the security quality of what you're delivering now becomes extremely important because it actually allows you to scale a security team. And now security engineers can actually be brought in to really talk about things of particularly high judgment, like dealing with particular threats or actual design decisions on threat modeling, things that you actually need someone to interact with in let's say a whiteboarding session or something like that. And you can see with many of these, some are even simple, like the style checkers are hugely important. Just for limiting, like I said before, using a linting tool to catch things that are improperly coded early on. And by using these mechanisms, you end up with a process of consistency, right? We talked about that rigor, and that consistency lets the security organization sort of know where you're at in a process and actually builds trust with them. And then the sort of rapid nature of which you can create and release can be vastly improved because you have this trust that's built that you're actually tackling the security problems. And this trust is backed up by logging and reporting that has immediate visibility up the chain. And so as we get sort of close to the closing out on the end here, I want to sort of touch on how do we enable sort of the people that we need to be security champions, because everyone needs to be a security owner and drive security down to the left. Like even if somebody is a novice to cybersecurity, there needs to be mechanisms in place. And this is again going back to working with leadership and human resources. There needs to be mechanisms to actually upskill people. These are elements around certification, building certifications, structures within organizations that allow people to gain new skills, paired programming for developers, pair a novice developer with a very security knowledgeable developer to actually sit side by side. We do this, and faster uptake on proper security practices. And then using those elements to drive culture, continuously drive it. So this comes back to the aspect of we need to drive cultural elements onto changing the organization so more and more groups or businesses within the organization actually use the DevSecOps practice. And, I talked about reducing human access and sort of our goal there and being able to catalog all your controls. With the visibility in the cloud, you actually now have the ability to do describe calls, so you can literally see your entire environment in code. These things actually have visibility that you didn't previously have. And I talked a little bit about, mechanisms for people, but mechanisms overall for culture. Like I'll highlight one, adopt a zero known defect approach. So any sort of existing CVE or vulnerability out there could easily automatically get caught in early testing, whether unit testing or regression testing as you're building a product, and remediated then. So by adopting that as a security expectation, you actually will have a higher security quality by the time it actually would get to production. And we really want to get to the place where, as we free up cycles for security engineers to actually build novel products and services to align the other teams. It's so important to actually let's have the security team build a threat management service that every team can now plug into to actually see and maintain the operations of their product. Like these different paradigms on letting security build systems that makes the lives of the business easier. And by shifting security ownership onto DevSecOps teams and down to the left to more the developer-centric element, it frees up security engineers to actually take time to build these mechanisms that can be can further automate functions and actually provide significant value for the business and make security as a differentiator for not just the business on a commercial aspect, but a differentiator as you deliver mission services, and knowing that you can actually create things and deploy them with a reduced risk surface. And with that, thank you.
อย่าลืมทำเซอร์เวย์นะคะเซอร์เวย์เป็นสิ่งสำคัญมากๆเพราะว่าเป็นสิ่งที่บอกว่าเราควรจะเตรียมเนื้อหาถัดไปสำหรับทุกๆท่านยังไงบ้างนะคะยังไงทำเซอร์เวย์นิดนึงเรามีสติกเกอร์เป็น ETDA โลโก้ ETDA ให้ถ้าเกิดว่าท่านใดชอบสติกเกอร์ ETDA นะคะอย่าง ติดเต็มหน้าจออย่างนี้ไม่ต้องตกใจนะคะเรามีสติกเกอร์เป็นของที่ระลึกให้ทำเซอร์เวย์แล้วก็เดินมาหานี่ได้เลยนะคะขอบคุณค่ะ
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทียังไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทียังไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไท ยงาดองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA วู้
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทีลงไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงาดองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA วู้
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้ เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทีลงไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทีลงไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
คือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA 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 พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือ ETDA สร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่ ETDA เชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่ ETDAพร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเราให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้าอย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจทุกเวลานาทีลงไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือ ETDA สร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่ ETDA
ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA 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 พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือ ETDA ETDA
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือ ETDA สร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่ ETDA เชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่ ETDA ของเรา ให้คนไทยได้ทำธุรกรรมคำเช้า อย่างปลอดภัยมั่นใจ ทุกเวลานาทีลงไปด้วยความหมายทุกสิ่งที่ทำน้อยใหญ่ พัฒนาการทำเพื่อให้เศรษฐกิจไทยงานองอาจยั่งยืนพวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA พวกเราคือเอ็ดดา ETDA
พวกเราไม่หยุดคิดพวกเราไม่หยุดทำไม่ยอมเป็นผู้ตามกล้าทำสิ่งใหม่รวมพลังศรัทธายึดมั่นในหัวใจพวกเราคือเอ็ดดาสร้างสะพานแข็งแรงเชื่อมทางไปข้างหน้าคือความหมายที่สื่อเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดาเชื่อมโยงโลกใบใหญ่ให้ใกล้เพียงปลายมือคือหน้าที่เอ็ดดา
topic, which is aligning to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And one of the reasons that we've been talking about this lately, we've been discussing this topic at a few summits and security roadshows globally, is looking at a framework like the CSF as a way to really produce an outcome-based governance framework for security. It's one of those elements that we've really seen an improvement on with a lot of industries, not just on the public sector side, but we've seen a lot of commercial entities really start looking at this framework as a means to really, analyze their current security program and look for improvements. So we're going to go a little bit and just talk about what the cybersecurity framework is, why to use it, why it makes sense in different industries, and how then that relates to AWS, your responsibilities in operating on AWS, and how our services can align to that framework in order to build a really good security posture as you operate on the platform. So NIST CSF is a cybersecurity framework that was designed to actually be, while mandatory for U.S. federal agencies now, as voluntary framework that global industry, both public and private, can use to actually both analyze their security program as well as institute it as sort of a governance, risk, and compliance framework. It's really focused on aligning best practices, and we'll show a little bit of that, how there's sort of traceability between different compliance frameworks and sort of best practice controls, and how the cybersecurity framework can intake those, as well as having a common taxonomy, which in the security industry is huge in order so that we all sort of are speaking about the same things within the threat landscape and how to operate and create mechanisms for security to actually institute good practices and governance on a system. And I talked about the standards. We'll go into that a little bit, and it's just a wide application because it's outcome focused, and the importance of having an outcome focused security program or security constraint on a program is hugely important in order to allow flexibility for security innovation. So sort of historically where the CSF came from, it was in around 2012, then the head of the National Security Agency had noted on a vast uptick on cyber attacks and intrusions, basically a 50% increase over that year. And as a result of that, there was an executive order placed All right, everyone hear me all right? All right, perfect. So in 2013, an executive order by the president instituted creation of a framework. And then in 2014, subsequently, an act of Congress made a sort of a legal requirement on crafting that from NIST. And I'll talk a little bit about who NIST is in a second. And it's important, and the impetus behind this, because it was recognized early on in 2012 that from a sort of cyber preparedness aspect, the head of the NSA had noted, you know, if we look at a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being least prepared, 10 most, we were running at about a 3. So having a framework that really could not only be institutionalized on the federal sort of agency government level, but for critical infrastructure could use in the commercial arena to actually build security programs was hugely vital into sort of moving up that maturity scale. So the creators and the builders of the framework were NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and among many of the programs they have, you know, they really craft what are national standards, and across all industries, not just information technology. And you know, inclusive of some of the things they do are like sort of certification for cryptography, as well as cybersecurity framework, as well as implementation of working with coalition partners on really designing standards that can be used globally. So originally, the CSF was targeted initially at really helping critical infrastructure providers, and this is sort of a look at how at that time we had broken up critical infrastructure and viewed it. This actually sort of needs to be updated because now we categorize it as critical infrastructure functions versus industries. But the truth sort of holds is really dealing with crafting solid security programs that sort of maintain this high bar of security for things that would actually be significantly damaging to a country if something would affect that particular industry or segment. But from that point, we saw a real evolution in using the cybersecurity framework and how it could be readily adapted to many different industries and needs. That flexibility has really added and bolstered its use globally. I think now we've seen it used across maybe 18, 19 different countries at this point. And really what it is one, being outcome focused, which I want to highlight as like the biggest point. And the reason that's such a big point is by being outcome focused, you do not put artificial constraints on security innovation. A real simplistic example is some old sort of framework you would have. Okay, you must implement an intrusion detection system or an IDS, versus I must protect data from intrusions, right? That minor crafting of the statement is hugely different. One is focused on outcome, one opens the door for building things that may not be an IDS to help improve your security posture versus an auditor looking at, well, you don't have an IDS and it says IDS, so you're going to get a finding, right? So that's sort of the two paradigms that we have to shift over towards that outcome focus, and just a craft of the language really changes that, and it's something we see pushing for. We see other programs globally, standards programs, and ISO and other folks, starting to push towards using that type of language to allow for security innovation to really foster and meet these challenges. Now, the CSF is broken up into sort of three major areas. You have the 5 core functions, which are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And then within those, those core functions will have other elements that we'll talk about in a second. But then you also have risk tiers, which are 4 tiers that go from sort of manual process element risk management to highly adaptive automated. And there's a reason, while it may seem like a maturity model, it's not quite, NIST doesn't really like to talk about it in the maturity model mindset, because it's really more about making risk-based decisions on the type of resource allocation you'll do, meaning I may have an element of a program where I'm fine with a manual process for the risk management because of the type of data. I don't need to invest or have the money to invest the resources to dealing with that. While in another more critical aspect, I really want to get to highly adaptive and automated, because I need that protection element and the rapid response there. And finally, we have the profiles, which are really sort of ingenious ways to sort of construct and view your security program. A common example on sort of how profiles are used is an as-is profile, meaning I'm going to construct a profile for how my security program currently operates, all the capabilities and elements, right? And then constructing a to-be profile. This is where I want it to go. And that to-be profile from the as-is can actually help direct cost allocation and investment and things on strategic alignment for how to get there. What are these security initiatives I need to undertake in order to meet that to-be profile? Excuse me. So those are really critical elements in actually constructing, one, knowing where you are from a security program and sort of having the metric now on it as you construct that profile, to knowing where you need to go in your government's framework. And one of the reasons I mentioned that we really like this capability as far as the CSF as a framework is its flexibility. One of the main examples we've seen is the financial industry took a look at this and mapped sort of 9 different regulatory elements, which include numerous requirements, backwards into the NIST CSF, and found that of those 9 vastly different regulatory requirements, they all can be filtered back into sort of the core 5 functions. And so there's this sort of master traceability aspect. This is one of the reasons, this sort of type of concept is one of the reasons why, for example, AWS meets so many different security regimes around the world, is the fact that we have a similar thing where we have this sort of master control domains, and those domains map to all the different various security and compliance regimes globally. And that allows us to take this sort of high watermark view in order to sort of deliver services that meet those capabilities globally. Similar thing, you have the flexibility in those types of frameworks to actually construct and mappings for where it's pertinent for you to do business. Even for government agencies, you could have an agency that not only deals with patient healthcare information, but also does payment processing, or does critical government functions on reporting and sustainability. All these things that have different elements they probably have to adhere to compliance requirements. So having something that can actually easily map to all those is really an improvement from a security governance standpoint. So when we look at each of the core 5 functions, we can see that they break down in sort of 23 different categories, and then of those sort of 108 different subcategories. And we'll look at a second sort of how those are constructed, but The real important thing is once we get down to the subcategory level, that's where you actually have these outcome-focused statements on how you actually construct alignment to a particular category. So, for example, we look at the identify function and asset management. And if you notice, if you read the asset management category, sort of nice description over what it entails, but at the subcategory level, you'll see like these very outcome-focused elements where physical devices and systems within an organization are inventoried, right? It doesn't tell you how to inventory them. It doesn't tell you what steps must be taken. It just says the outcome. They're inventoried. And a simple turn of that language is really important, especially when you're looking at crafting policy and how to implement government's policy for an entire organization. Those types of statements crafted actually now allow you to change from, let's say, instead of having to buy a third-party system to do inventory management for all my systems, now I can use scripting and API structure to list an inventory, right? Like you get the same function and the same outcome out of two different types of practices. And one of the other huge benefits of this, as you can see on the informative references, each of these right now is currently mapped to everything from COBIT to ISO and the CIS. And so you automatically start getting this view of how these things stack up against other frameworks and how you can sort of align if you have to comply with a variety of different things or mapping them yourself. And from what I understand, these informative references are going to be continually evolving and adding more to the mix. And what they all sort of come back to is the idea of these control statements you would see in traditional NIST publications. But those are just adjunct to it. So, for example, this informative reference for component inventory, this is actually from a special publication from NIST called 853 that talks about the control. That is, for example, only informative in the nature that I'd have to align with some type of NIST guidance. Like if I'm in the US, I would have to do FedRAMP or FISMA, these two different governance practices. But here they can just sort of inform how you'd want to construct your program, and you don't need to actually technically draw a line and use that publication. It's just a way of means of sort of mentally mapping what that subcategory means when it comes to enacting a cybersecurity control. And these are sectors and areas that we've seen it used. And this is one of the reasons that we've started talking about it, because our customers are talking about it. Our customers globally are talking about it and allowing to deal with, we've seen hospitality industry as well, which isn't listed here, and a variety of healthcare and other government agencies around the world. So it's one of the things that also nicely fits into other aspects of things where we talk about crafting and operating on AWS in methodology form. For example, well architected, if you haven't heard about that. That's sort of a way to get optimize operations on AWS and across a few different pillars, including security and infrastructure and elements. And then there's a cloud adoption framework, which I mentioned earlier, which is sort of how to move into AWS in a secure, safe way. This sort of can underpin like building your security governance program to both help you use something like the cloud adoption framework to move into AWS, and then something like the well architected to actually now operationally optimize your capabilities in AWS. And all can be sort of measured by the standard framework, but we'll look at that in a little bit. And we also see ISO sort of taking up the banner for this. They're in the process, the last I checked, to build 2 publications around the cybersecurity framework that are sort of influenced by it to make them eventually ISO standards. So, and we also, just from a reference standpoint, do have a white paper with a additional appendicized workbook for one, how to align with it on AWS, and then sort of a service mapping for how our services map to each of the 5 categories in the NIST CSF. So one of the things that is really interesting is when you're actually using this to construct as a measurement tool, which is good, to initially get that baseline of your environment, is you can look at all of those categories and start capturing information based off of what is particular to sort of the risk space that you're in. When we looked at sort of looking at the risk tiers, one is identifying which one you sort of operate at, which one you would like to get to. Do you need to break them apart, per particular business units or service functions or mission functions? Meaning, like I said, you may need to live with a sort of more manual, less adaptive risk management program in some areas to reduce resource cost, while in other areas you want more. It's sort of identifying those capabilities and then creating that profile which actually looks at what that program is and isn't working and where you want to go. But one of the other elements on this is you could construct a profile. For example, I said patient healthcare information, if you have that. So if you had specific requirements around healthcare information, taking what that current profile is, you could create a 2B specifically for that, dealing with that type of sector information, and then construct and manage your risk and cybersecurity initiatives accordingly in order to get to that profile for that particular system or business unit or service. And then you could create profiles based in those manners, or more holistically, a 2B that encompasses a variety of capabilities. So we'll talk a little bit now sort of how this aligns with our services and using it. If we look at the identify function, we have a variety of services that can be used. This is not an exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea of different elements. I know in other sessions we've talked about CloudWatch and IAM and Macy, for example, to identify sensitive data in object storage. So these are all areas that you can perform some type of functions using those services, some type of identify functions that are really vital depending on to the level that you need to institute on things. For example, if you had IAM and understanding, what does that relate to as far as I construct my environment, and those other capabilities involved, meaning is IAM in itself siloed, or do we need to talk about now account federation, other things on how to do and limited time, just-in-time access capabilities like Anchors talked about earlier. Then we have protective measures. We have things that you want to put in place to reduce the risk that you may have. So, and these are elements that, as you notice, span a variety of things. When you talk about a cybersecurity program and you look at building sort of protective measures, example, you see training and certification on here. So don't ever overlook the people. The people are vastly important to actually this equation and making sure that you have the right mechanisms in place to sort of educate and help sort of lift the knowledge base of the folks interacting with the systems to do it in a very secure way. And that's actually for the systems that people need to interact with, that is a protective mechanism by giving them education in how to properly do it. Besides all of the technical controls that are around this, both from things like single sign-on and identity management areas and protective, having those guardrails in place, to more things in the identification sort of detect nature, which we'll see in the next category. But things like then bolstering things with AWS config, which we talked a bit about earlier, is having those elements that actually can institute a proper configuration profile for a resource and enforce those mechanisms, and then coupling that with something like Lambda to do it in a more automated fashion. That's when you start looking at things that go up those risk tier profiles, when you now have, let's say, tier 4, which is highly adaptive, You could have things like AWS config do something, monitor instantiation and control the configuration control of a particular resource, and then if something starts going astray, having Lambda automatically reset that configuration, do reporting, do a type of playbook, if you will, on it. So that you can get to very highly adaptive or sort of risk managed processes in here, or you can keep it to whatever level is appropriate for the organization. So if we look at it from a sort of a very simplified architecture point of view, we have sort of an example of a sort of outer shell protection element with AWS Shield, which takes away from denial of service elements, and then coupled with WAF, which you'll have the workshop on that this afternoon. So I won't delve too deeply into that, but for having that sort of web application firewall element to help mitigate incoming traffic issues. And then load balancers and that can actually have security profiles and elements configured with them, down to web ACLs, which might be a little hard to see on there, which can actually control traffic within the VPC. So you can actually start constructing a very defense and depth mindset with how you're going to build these groups. And again, this could be at any sort of risk tier, for example, on this, whether these are more sort of less infrastructure as code, more sort of manual setup processes, to up at the higher end where these are actually coded practices. And as we were talking with DevSecOps, this is actually a configured code base that can be pulled from and instituted based from a code repo by someone who's building a service. So you could have it very highly automated. And then, of course, as we build out the architecture with encryption elements at the lower levels, and then database encryption, and then when we talk about availability aspects with replication built into it. But again, as you would outline this, you could outline this as, for example, here's my 2B profile. Not bad, has some security mechanisms at play in it, and it's built out. But if I want to make it, or I want to make my as-is profile to more of my 2B, then you start putting in, okay, what about mechanisms, processes, things for having, for example, adding guard duty to have detect, and then having automated triggers off of guard duty to fix sort of security invariants that are in the architecture. So you can actually sort of construct how those particular architectures exist now and where they're going. And then if we look at detect, we have numerous sort of services that fall into those lines. Guard duty is sort of the exemplary service that we usually talk about in this arena because of its ability to take sort of machine learning and look at threats and actually notifications off of those, and then be completely integrated into automated response. Or feed things like Security Hub, which will give you sort of a visualized dashboard of the security hygiene of your environment. And then getting to the responsive phase, and these are elements where now, as you sort of would also move up on the risk tiers on how type of adaptive you'd want to be, you now take things that are a multitude of different services and work them in conjunction. For guard duty, for example, it's taking CloudWatch logs, CrowdTrail events, threat intelligence, other elements to sort of understand and identify problematic elements in the environment, and then using automation off of Lambda or using combination of different type of workflows that you'd want to build out those automated responsive actions. But from a sort of GRC perspective, sort of that governance, risk, and compliance program that you had built, you want to look at this holistically too, which is what about third-party entities that I may need to do business with, right? So contractors or outside elements. So that's what you notice, sort of AWS professional services there with Zipline or our partners. Like, you want to look at it sort of holistically on how do I construct my program to not just include some technical elements that are in my architectures, but actually what type of resources do I need to bear overall for my environment, and when do I need particular expertise that may need to come from outside entities. And we can sort of look at example, sort of an automation chain for a responsive action. And here it gives sort of this very straightforward but powerful example of using guard duty to actually create a CloudWatch event, and then from that event trigger a Lambda function. For example, if we say guard duty notices some type of problematic IP, and then pushes that to CloudWatch events, the Lambda function kicks off, and then it automatically writes and updates a WAF rule to now block that IP address to filter it out. So those are something, while at the same time cutting a ticket, paging security personnel as appropriate, right? Like more and more automated and enhanced as you sort of move up that stack. But at the core, it's figuring out with these sort of existing services and profiles, like how you want to build those workflow processes to actually meet that security bar that you've defined by using the NIST CSF. And finally, we talk a little bit about recover. And recover is sometimes overlooked. I've been at many agencies and customers where they'll have some type of disaster recovery scenario or plan. They'll do some testing, some continuity operations testing, but it's generally never done fully because you can't, I would argue it's almost impossible to do a full disaster recovery training with an IT infrastructure, without really damaging something. So you really have to wonder on how to construct the best planning for those elements. And one of the things that AWS allows you, and in cloud in general, is the ability now to have like true sort of A/B environments, right? Now I can replicate my entire environment somewhere else and test it. Something that, back in my on-premise days was extremely difficult to do without impacting the business. So now it's planning what are those appropriate recovery functions and how to do it. And even more so, getting good value out of the resources you use, meaning that instead of having sort of a primary site, alternate site sort of construct that we definitely used to look at as the ideal sort of build on emergency preparedness and planning, why not use the resources at the alternate site, so to speak? I can have a distributed system that can actually scale and take flexibility. So now I'm not paying for services I'm not using, and I can actually spread out my service usage across many sites. So it is immediately ready to take and scale in the basis of an impact happening. So, and one of the other elements I want to mention is going back to the cloud adoption framework, as well as well architected. When you look at using something like the NIST CSF or constructing your own governance plan, always sort of take into account technological changes around cybersecurity especially. And as you sort of build out your policy and planning elements, I highly suggest like looking at the cloud adoption framework and the security pillar in there in order to look at sort of the mechanisms you want to take into account as you write policy. A lot of people end up using existing policy structures or making minor modifications that sort of can have cascading effects later on when you start sort of moving to the cloud or dampening innovation. So when you look at things like the CSF and sort of outcome-based focus on writing policy controls, really look and use that as a mechanism to review your own sort of policy compendiums and policy books on how we're looking and how we're writing, constructing these policies to actually be able to evolve in an innovative fashion, whether it's moving to the cloud or other sort of new capabilities you want it to develop. So with that, thank you very much.
ยังไงเดี๋ยวเรา
กว้างใหญ่พร้อมให้เราก้าวทันจงมุ่งมั่นให้เป็นวันของเรา ให้คนไทย